Good evening, wherever you are, whether settling into bed or letting the last thoughts of the day melt quietly into stillness. Welcome. Tonight, we will step softly into the twilight edges of history, into a world not shaped by monarchs or machines, but by names, whispers, and a confident handshake asterisk. You may know the Brooklyn Bridge. You may have walked across its span, felt its cables hum faintly underfoot, seen its arches catch the early light. But tonight we turn not to the bridge itself, but to a man who, with little more than ink and conviction, claimed it as his own, and sold it not once, many times. His name was George C. Parker, and his story is one stitched from the fabric of pure invention, of deeds and titles, of immigrant dreams, and the quiet power of self-assurance at your breath slow. Let the corners of the world soften, and join us now in a city bustling with steam and shadow, where illusions could be bought with pocket change, and a man in a well-cut coat could sell you anything. Subscribe, and let us begin. In the great tapestry of New York City's history, there are threads of steel and stone, of immigrant hope and industrial triumph. There are the grand towers of finance, the endless streams of carriages and later automobiles, the buzz of a city that seemed, even in the early 20th century, to be moving faster than the rest of the world. And somewhere woven into that same tapestry is a quieter, stranger thread, the one that tells of men and women whose fortunes were not made in the factories or the banks, but in the shadows between law and opportunity. People whose genius for persuasion and invention might have made them captains of industry had they been inclined toward the honest route. Instead, they became something else entirely. In our last episode, we met one such character, a man whose charm and nerve led him to some of the most improbable grifts in history. And if you thought that was audacious, allow me to introduce someone who took the art of the scam and raised it into an almost mythic performance. His name was George C. Parker, and while there is much about him that has faded into the fog of history, one claim remains utterly clear. George C. Parker was the man who sold the Brooklyn Bridge, not once, not twice, dozens of times now, selling a bridge, especially one of the most famous in the world, is a feat that immediately invites disbelief. Surely nobody could be so gullible. Surely the police would have intervened the very first time. Surely the story must be exaggerated. And yet here we are, over a century later, still telling it. That alone should give us pause. Before we get to the how, it's worth remembering the where and the when. Parker operated in a New York City that was not the sleek grid of glass and concrete we know today, but a living, breathing organism of brick streets, horse-drawn carts, saloon lights flickering into the night, and an endless influx of human ambition. Ellis Island was busy in those years, receiving thousands of immigrants every week. These were people with dreams, big enough to cross oceans, but often with little understanding of the laws, the customs, or the very language of their new home. They were both the lifeblood of the city's growth and, to men like Parker, an endless source of opportunity. The bridge itself, at the heart of this story, was more than a marvel of engineering. It was an emblem. Completed in 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time, a physical and symbolic link between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Its stone towers rose with a kind of cathedral-like solemnity. Its cables, as thick as a man's torso, stretched in a perfect web across the East River. To cross it was to feel part of something bigger than oneself, part of the great forward march of progress. And so when George C. Parker claimed that he owned this bridge, that it was his property to sell, and that an ambitious investor could take control of the toll rights for a handsome sum, well, it was absurd, yes. But it was absurd in the way great dreams often are, and Parker understood that the line between ridiculous and visionary is thinner than most people realize. The man himself was, by all accounts, unremarkable to look at. Medium height, neat in his dress, with the kind of face that could slip unnoticed into a crowd, or win your confidence in a matter of minutes. He spoke plainly, with just enough detail to sound informed, and just enough warmth to make you want to believe him. A confidence man in the truest sense of the phrase. Over the next hour and a half, we'll follow Parker's career from its beginnings, through the height of his audacity, and into the inevitable unraveling. Along the way we'll meet some of his marks, explore the city as it was, and see exactly how the sale of the Brooklyn Bridge became more than just a scam. It became a piece of American folklore, and perhaps by the end you'll understand why Parker's story has outlived the man himself, and why his bridge, or rather, the bridge he never owned, still casts a shadow over every too-good-to-be-true offer you've ever heard. George C. Parker's early life, like so many figures of his kind, is cloaked in an ambiguity that might be deliberate. Con men rarely leave behind neat, reliable biographies. After all, the truth was never their main commodity. What little we know suggests that he was born in the early 1860s, somewhere in New York State. His childhood, though largely undocumented, unfolded during a time when America was undergoing profound change. The last echoes of the Civil War still lingered. Industrialization was reshaping the economy, and cities like New York were growing into bustling centers that felt almost like countries unto themselves. In the 1870s and 1880s, New York City was a magnet for ambition. It was not yet the skyscraper forest we picture today, but it was already a place of enormous energy. The streets rang with the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the shouts of street vendors hawking oysters or newspapers, the calls of ferry captains down by the docks. The scent of coal smoke mixed with that of freshly baked bread from corner bakeries, and the air was alive with the chatter of dozens of languages. To a boy growing up in or near this environment, the city would have felt like a living, breathing creature, dangerous, exciting, and full of possibility, if Parker did have a modest upbringing, as some accounts suggest. He would have been surrounded by examples of both legitimate and questionable enterprise. The city's great fortunes were being made in railroads, shipping, steel, and real estate. But there was also a thriving undercurrent of graft, gambling, and clever trickery. From the infamous political machine of Tammany Hall to the card sharps, along the Bowery, New York offered endless lessons in persuasion, deception, and the bending of rules. One thing is certain, by the time Parker was a young man, he had mastered the skill that would define his life, the ability to convince someone that what he was saying was not only possible, but inevitable. That skill, honed in an era before instant communication, before easy fact-checking, could be devastatingly effective. Information traveled slowly, official records were not easily accessible, and an air of confidence could often pass for proof. To understand Parker's eventual scams, it's important to picture the kind of New York in which he operated. The Brooklyn Bridge, for example, had been completed only a few decades earlier. It was the pride of the city, a technological marvel, and a tourist attraction in its own right. People came from across the country to see it, to walk across its broad promenade, to marvel at its soaring towers. It was, in a sense, a symbol of the boundless possibilities of America itself. Now imagine being new to the country, stepping off a ship at Ellis Island after weeks at sea. You'd be tired, perhaps overwhelmed, but you'd also be filled with ambition. You'd look at the skyline of Manhattan and see opportunity in every window, in every street. And then imagine meeting a man, neatly dressed, smiling warmly, speaking with the easy assurance of a native New Yorker, who told you that you could own a piece of that opportunity. Not a storefront, not a small parcel of land, but a stake in something magnificent. Something like the Brooklyn Bridge. Before Parker ever tried to sell the bridge, he likely tested his skills in smaller arenas. There's evidence he was involved in real estate dealings, or more accurately, in convincing people to pay for property he didn't own. Fake deeds, fraudulent leases, promises of future development that existed only in his imagination. Real estate scams were particularly effective in that era because documentation was not centralized. A convincing-looking piece of paper could often substitute for genuine proof of ownership. And here lies a key element of Parker's genius. He understood that the presentation of legitimacy was often more powerful than legitimacy itself. A forged document stamped with an official-looking seal, a handshake accompanied by the right turn of phrase, an introduction made in the right social setting. All of these could create an aura of trustworthiness that was very difficult to pierce. As we move through Parker's life, it becomes clear that he was not simply a trickster chasing quick cash. He was a craftsman of illusion, someone who understood the psychology of belief. His scams were not crude or rushed. They were carefully tailored to the hopes, ambitions, and blind spots of his targets. He didn't just take money, he sold dreams. That was the essence of his work. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were also a perfect breeding ground for someone like Parker. Immigration was at an all-time high, bringing in people unfamiliar with American law and property rights. The city's law enforcement was overburdened, often corrupt, and frequently more concerned with violent crime than with fraud. Newspapers occasionally reported on swindles, but the city's size meant that most victims preferred to keep their humiliation quiet rather than face public ridicule. This silence was Parker's ally. Every successful con was like a stone dropped into a deep river, gone from sight, leaving only the faintest ripple. By the 1890s, Parker had established himself as more than just a petty hustler. He was entering the realm of the grand con, where the rewards were much greater, and the risks, though higher, were still manageable for someone of his skill. The Brooklyn Bridge scam was not a one-off stunt, but rather the crown jewel in a repertoire that included selling Madison Square Garden, the Statue of Liberty, and even the Metropolitan Museum of Art to unwitting buyers. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also served a purpose. The more outrageous the claim, the more it dazzled those who wanted to believe. And here's the paradox at the heart of Parker's success. The very absurdity of his claims made them feel to his marks all the more exclusive. After all, what could be more impressive than buying something nobody else even knew was for sale? Parker offered not just property, but a sense of being on the inside of something extraordinary. For an ambitious newcomer, that feeling was intoxicating. As we prepare to step into the details of Parker's first recorded sale of the Brooklyn Bridge, it's worth pausing to note the artistry in what he was doing. Yes, it was theft. Yes, it was deception. But it was also theater, a performance in which every gesture, every word, every piece of paper played a part. He was selling a fantasy so vivid that it overpowered reason. The stage was set, a city bursting with ambition, an engineering marvel that seemed to embody the American dream, and a man who knew exactly how to weave those elements into a story. Someone would pay dearly to believe. In the next segment, we'll step into the moment when Parker first sold the Brooklyn Bridge, examining not just how he did it, but why it worked and how it would work again and again for years to come. George C. Parker didn't step into the spotlight as the Brooklyn Bridge's unofficial real estate agent overnight. Like all master craftsmen, whether they work in marble, paint, or pure imagination, Parker learned his trade over time, shaping it with practice, refining it with mistakes, and polishing it until the scam gleamed like gold. In the late 1800s, New York was a city of extremes. Mansions along Fifth Avenue flaunted marble staircases and imported chandeliers, while tenements just a few blocks away were crammed with families living 6 or 7 to a room. It was a place where a man could lose himself, and just as easily reinvent himself. The city's sheer size and constant movement created the perfect camouflage for anyone who didn't want to be found or didn't want people to know too much about them. Parker understood this from the start. The anonymity of New York was his cloak. The city's relentless appetite for opportunity was his sword. He began small, as many swindlers do. A forged signature here, a piece of fake property paperwork there. You might say Parker's earliest Ventures were training runs, safe enough to walk away from if things got messy, but profitable enough to keep him interested. One of his first successful cons involved selling a bogus exclusive photography license to a young man from Pennsylvania. The victim had just arrived at Grand Central Station, suitcase in hand, eyes wide as saucers. Parker approached him on the platform like an old friend claiming to represent the city's Department of Public Photography, a department which, of course, did not exist. The pitch was simple. All photographs taken within New York's public parks, bridges, and monuments required a special license, and Parker just happened to be able to issue one. The price? A heavily discounted $25. Adjusted for inflation, that's several $100s today. Not bad for a few minutes' work. The young man paid. Parker handed him an ornate but utterly meaningless certificate, and the victim walked away feeling like a legitimate entrepreneur. By the time he realized there was no such regulation, Parker was already halfway across town, working his next angle. What Parker had stumbled upon, perhaps without fully realizing it yet, was the intoxicating magic of selling something intangible, something that existed only in the minds of the buyer and seller. It wasn't a product you could drop or break. It wasn't a service you could measure in hours or minutes. It was an idea, and ideas in the right hands could be worth more than gold. This was the seed that would eventually blossom into Parker's most famous scam, selling the Brooklyn Bridge. But before we get there, we have to understand how Parker's mind worked, because that's what made him dangerous. He had an uncanny ability to read people, their accents, their clothes, the way they carried themselves. A man wearing brand new shoes but an ill-fitting coat might be someone who'd just come into a bit of money. A woman clutching a travel guidebook could be an out-of-towner, dazzled by the city's grandeur and unsure of its rules. Parker could pick out these details in seconds, then weave them into a conversation that made the other person feel like they were in the presence of a trustworthy local. He was also a chameleon. Depending on the situation, he could present himself as a wealthy businessman, a city official, a retired engineer, or a helpful guide. The trick was to know just enough about each role to make it convincing, and to never ever break character. New York in the 1890s offered no shortage of marks. The city was flooded with immigrants from Europe, farmers from the Midwest, and entrepreneurs from all over the country. Many arrived with dreams of making it big. They brought cash, ambition, and, most importantly, a willingness to believe in big promises. Parker learned quickly that the best victims were those who thought they were getting an inside deal on something exclusive. Greed, pride, and the thrill of being in on a secret, these were the emotional hooks he baited his traps with. One of Parker's favorite warm-up schemes in this era involved the sale of fake business franchises. He would stroll into a bustling cafe, order a cup of coffee, and strike up a conversation with whoever sat beside him. "Say," he'd begin casually, "have you heard about the new soda fountain franchise the city's approving? Only a handful of licenses left. His victim, if suitably curious, would ask questions. Parker would answer with a mix of plausible details and outright fabrications. Within an hour, he'd be walking away with a down payment for a business that didn't exist, and the franchise holder would be dreaming of profits from a corner soda stand that would never open. These smaller jobs weren't just about money. They were about testing methods, learning what worked and what didn't. How long could a conversation be stretched before suspicion arose? How much official-looking paperwork was necessary to close the deal? Did victims prefer a sense of urgency, or did they need to be courted slowly? Parker approached these questions like a scientist, gathering data and refining his technique until he could close a sale in minutes without raising alarm. It's worth remembering that this was an era before modern policing and instant communication. If Parker swindled a visitor from Kansas on Monday, the chances that the victim could alert the authorities before Parker moved on were slim to none. By the time the Mark realized what had happened, they'd be back on a train home, embarrassed and reluctant to admit they'd been duped. Many never reported the crime at all by the mid-1890s. Parker's confidence and his bank account had grown. He was ready for bigger, bolder moves. He had learned that the most valuable things in New York weren't jewels or cash. They were landmarks. The city's monuments had a kind of magic to them. People who visited the city wanted a piece of that magic, and Parker intended to sell it to them, quite literally. The Brooklyn Bridge, barely a decade old at the time, was the crown jewel. It was an engineering marvel, a symbol of progress, and a point of pride for the city. More importantly for Parker, it was the kind of property that outsiders could easily imagine being privately owned. After all, railroads had private owners. Else, why not bridges? The idea was audacious, absurd, and, to Parker's mind, perfect. If he could convince someone that he had the legal right to sell or lease the Brooklyn Bridge, the payoff would dwarf anything he'd made selling fake licenses or soda franchises. But to pull it off, he would need to orchestrate the performance of his life, complete with forged deeds, official seals, and just enough insider detail to make it believable. Parker had found his masterpiece. Now it was time to build it, brick by imaginary brick. By the late 1890s, George C. Parker was not just a man running a scam. He was a man running a business. And like any good businessman, he had a system. This wasn't a one-off trick. This was an ongoing enterprise with repeatable steps, predictable profits, and enough variety to keep it from going stale. The Brooklyn Bridge was still his flagship product, his best seller, if you will. But by now, Parker understood something crucial. People don't just buy the bridge because they want to own a piece of it. They buy it because they see themselves in it. The bridge was a canvas on which they painted their own ambitions. One customer might see the bridge as a toll gold mine. Imagine charging every wagon, every motor car, every pedestrian who dared cross. Another might see it as a monument, a piece of civic pride they could brag about to friends back home. Parker, with his silver tongue and rehearsed charm, knew exactly how to tailor his pitch to each personality. If you were a man of commerce, he'd talk profits and exclusive rights. If you were a man of vanity, he'd talk prestige and status. If you were a wide-eyed immigrant with dreams of making it in America, he'd talk opportunity and self-reliance. By this time, Parker had upgraded his presentation. Early on, he'd simply meet marks in hotel lobbies or on street corners. But as his reputation for charm grew, so did his ambition for spectacle. He began renting small offices, sometimes just for a few weeks at a time, in reputable buildings. The walls would be adorned with framed deeds and official-looking maps of New York. There might be a photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge in a gold frame, with a small plaque underneath reading something like "Owned by G.C. Parker and Co." A secretary, sometimes a real hire, sometimes a friend playing a part, might sit outside shuffling papers, giving the impression that this was a legitimate, bustling business. The power of that kind of presentation can't be overstated. You see, a man sitting in a dingy corner cafe claiming to own the Brooklyn Bridge sounds ridiculous. But a man in a suit behind a desk in an office with a frosted glass door and a city view, that man commands respect, and more importantly, that man feels real. The mechanics of the sale were as smooth as silk. First came the authority play. Parker would establish himself as the rightful owner, often producing forged documents, complete with seals and ribbons. These papers, sometimes on thick parchment, had the weight and texture of authenticity, because in that era physicality mattered more than anything. Then came the urgency hook. The bridge was in high demand. Perhaps a wealthy syndicate was eyeing it. Perhaps the city wanted to reclaim it. Whatever the story, the message was clear. Act now or lose out forever. Finally came the price anchor. Parker rarely started with his true desired amount. Instead, he would float an absurdly high price, only to begrudgingly lower it after. Some negotiation, making the buyer feel as if they'd scored a bargain. He was patient. He didn't rush his marks unless he had to. He let them ask questions, let them feel smart, let them believe they were discovering opportunities he had accidentally revealed. It's important to understand that tolls in this period were not unusual. Bridges, ferries, turnpikes all often charged a fee. For an immigrant or a small-time investor, the idea of owning the Brooklyn Bridge and charging tolls was not far-fetched. Parker leaned heavily into that cultural norm. He'd run the numbers for them. At just 1 penny per pedestrian, a nickel per carriage, and 10 cents per automobile, your earnings could exceed $10,000 a week. He'd scribble calculations on paper. Making the math dance in front of them, some buyers would get stars in their eyes. They'd start imagining the life, the big house, the fine clothes, the respect of their peers. Parker knew that once. A man's mind started living in the fantasy. His wallet would soon follow. One of Parker's strengths was his ability to keep moving. He rarely sold the bridge twice to the same type of buyer in the same place. This kept the rumor mill from catching up to him too quickly. He would rotate between out-of-town businessmen, newly arrived immigrants, and ambitious small-time hustlers looking to level up. Sometimes he'd sell it in the morning and move to a completely different district by nightfall. His mobility was his shield. Of course, not every sale went perfectly. Occasionally, a buyer would try to exercise their ownership too soon, usually by showing up at the bridge with tools, wood, or even a small toll booth. More than once, this led to a scene. Police. Officers, bemused at first, would grow suspicious as the same story repeated with different people. But Parker was clever. If word got back to him that a buyer had been stopped, he'd vanish for weeks, sometimes months, resurfacing under a new name with a slightly altered story. By the turn of the century, Parker's Brooklyn Bridge hustle was more than a scam. It was becoming a whispered legend. Other con men in New York knew of him, some even trying to copy his approach, but few could match his poise. The thing about Parker was that he wasn't just selling an object. He was selling a dream wrapped in the authority of officialdom. And as long as people wanted to believe, he could keep selling. By the first decade of the 20th century, George C. Parker had become something of a fixture in New York City's underbelly, a shadowy, smiling figure whose reputation among the less than law-abiding was equal parts awe and disbelief. He wasn't a common thief. He wasn't even the type of swindler who burned his bridges, figuratively speaking, though perhaps also quite literally, considering his favorite property. No, Parker was a man who could walk into a bar full of skeptics, and by the end of the night, have three of them believing they could wake up tomorrow as the private owners of a public landmark. But there was one thing Parker had not counted on. Longevity of luck was a fickle thing. Even the most silver-tongued of men could not outrun the slow and methodical gears of the law forever. It began, as many of these stories do, with a single thread, frayed and pulled by accident. One of Parker's more recent marks, a Polish immigrant named Janusz Kowalski, had arrived in New York only months earlier. He'd been dazzled by Parker's pitch, a glorious tale about the financial opportunities to be had in owning the Brooklyn Bridge and charging tolls. For Janusz, the idea of collecting coins from every carriage, wagon, and soon automobile that crossed the span was the very definition of the American dream. And Parker? Well, he seemed like a man with connections, in all the right places, even producing official-looking papers with seals that shone like sunlight on water. The transaction was made, money exchanged, and Janusz, burning with pride, set about trying to erect a toll booth at the Manhattan entrance to the bridge. The police, unsurprisingly, disagreed with this venture. Janusz's confusion, mixed with the embarrassment of having been publicly laughed off by officers, might have ended there. had he not decided to complain loudly to the wrong people. He began to tell his story in saloons and workers' boarding houses, and to anyone who would listen. He didn't name Parker at first, perhaps out of shame, but word filtered through. The New York Police Department was no stranger to scam artists. The city had always been a magnet for those who saw opportunity in the unregulated edges of urban life. But Parker was different. His name had appeared in whispers for years, often attached to unbelievable schemes. Now, with Yanusha's story, a clearer picture began to form for detectives. They realized they'd heard versions of the same complaint before. An Italian mason, a German tailor, even a few Americans fresh off trains from the Midwest. Each had been promised ownership of the Brooklyn Bridge, or Madison Square Garden, or the Statue of Liberty itself, and each had been left with nothing but a worthless piece of paper and an expensive lesson in skepticism. Detective Michael J. O'Connell, a man with a calm manner and a face weathered from years of dealing with both crooks and the desperate, took a personal interest in Parker's case. O'Connell wasn't quick to anger, but he had a particular dislike for predators who targeted new arrivals, those who spoke little English, who were dazzled by the city's grandeur, and who didn't yet understand that some things were, by their very nature, public and untouchable. O'Connell began, gathering every complaint, every scrap of testimony he could find. Slowly a pattern emerged. The mark would meet Parker somewhere public, a ferry dock, a hotel lobby, sometimes even on the bridge itself. The pitch would come, smooth as silk, always backed by forged documents. The money would change hands, and Parker would disappear into the city's swirl before the mark had time to question the deal. In a way, the bridge had always been more than a mere structure for Parker. It was a stage, and like any performer, he relied on the drama of the setting to carry the act. The bridge was still young in the early years of the century, a feat of engineering that symbolized modernity and progress. Standing on it, with the wind whipping off the East River and the city skyline spread out like a promise, Parker could point to its towers and claim ownership with a confidence that felt unshakable. He would gesture to the steady flow of carriages and pedestrians, painting word pictures of the fortune to be made in tolls. Why, he might say, you could make your investment back within a year, 2 at the outside, and after that, pure profit. The charm of the pitch wasn't just in its financial logic, it was in the grandeur of the dream. In the spring of 1906, Parker came dangerously close to being caught. A mark, realizing within hours he had been duped, reported the swindle to police. O'Connell himself led the team that tracked Parker to a boarding house in Lower Manhattan. But Parker was nothing if not slippery. He slipped out the back minutes before the officers arrived, leaving behind only a neatly folded suit jacket and a hat perched on the bedpost, as if he'd vanished into thin air. This brush with capture didn't deter him. If anything, it emboldened him. Parker began to take greater risks, perhaps believing his own legend. His scams grew in scale, the sums larger, the targets more prominent. He even, according to one story, attempted to sell the Metropolitan Museum of Art to a wealthy industrialist. Visiting from Chicago, the deal fell through not because the man suspected a con, but because he wanted assurances about where his name would appear on the museum's facade. The real turning point came in late 1907, when a sting operation, months in the making, finally took shape. O'Connell, having cultivated informants in the city's taverns and among its street hustlers, learned that Parker was preparing to close another Brooklyn Bridge sale, this time to a businessman from Pennsylvania with more money than caution. The plan was simple. Let the transaction proceed far enough to confirm Parker's involvement, then move in before the money could vanish. The buyer, privately informed of the setup, agreed to play along. What Parker didn't know was that the businessman had already met with police. Now, George C. Parker had by this point perfected his craft in a way that most con men could only dream of. In the earlier years of his scam, selling the Brooklyn Bridge had been almost a novelty, a clever stunt that pulled in a tidy profit from an unsuspecting mark. But as time went on, Parker began to see the potential for something much bigger. Why sell the bridge once a month when you could sell it twice a week? Why just target immigrants when you could hook businessmen, speculators, and ambitious dreamers with the same story dressed up for different ears? And so, what began as a cheeky side hustle transformed into what could almost be described as a business empire, a criminal enterprise so consistent, so well-oiled that Parker himself likely thought of it as a legitimate occupation. Not morally legitimate, of course, but in his mind, he was simply running a company, and the product was opportunity, or at least the illusion of it. Let's set the scene. It's a Tuesday morning in Lower Manhattan, sometime around the turn of the century. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and river water. Horses plop down the cobblestone streets, pulling carts full of produce from the markets. Street cars rattle, by their conductors yelling for passengers to step lively. Men in bowler hats and long coats stride past, briefcases swinging, on their way to offices, while newsboys bark the headlines about strikes, political scandals, and baseball scores. Somewhere in the middle of this bustling picture stands George C. Parker, waiting, not waiting idly, no. George was never idle when there was money to be made. He was scanning faces, reading posture, listening for accents. He had an eye for people who didn't quite blend in, the ones looking up at the skyline in awe, their pace just a little too slow, their clothing a little too new for city life. In those wide-eyed expressions, George saw opportunity. One of his favorite haunts was the area near City Hall and the base of the Brooklyn Bridge on the Manhattan side. There tourists and newcomers gathered, craning their necks to marvel at the bridge's stone towers and sweeping cables. It was the perfect spot for Parker's opening move. He'd strike up a conversation, casual as you please. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he'd say, nodding toward the bridge. "Cost the city a fortune to build and worth every penny. You know," here he'd drop his voice a little, leaning in, "it's not just a public crossing. It's a privately owned enterprise. Toll rights and all. Imagine the revenue from that. For many, that was all it took. The hook was in, but Parker didn't just leave it at a vague claim. He produced proof. Over the years, he accumulated a remarkable collection of forged documents, deeds printed on official-looking paper, complete with seals, letters supposedly from city officials, and even architectural blueprints to add a touch of technical authenticity. He tailored his pitch depending on the mark. To the eager immigrant with a few $100s saved, he'd talk about security, a stable investment in America's booming infrastructure. To the wealthy speculator, he'd emphasize exclusivity, the chance to own a piece of one of the most recognizable landmarks in the country, with guaranteed income from tolls. And to the ambitious hustler who fancied himself a player in New York real estate, Parker hinted at inside connections, opportunities only available to those who knew the right people. And here's the astonishing part. People didn't just hand over money. They sometimes paid for improvements. More than one victim took their ownership seriously enough to hire workers to build gates or set up toll booths at the entrances to the bridge. Imagine the scene. A poor laborer hauling lumber and tools up to the bridge's approach, hammering together a little toll booth, all under the watchful direction of a proud new owner who had no idea they'd been conned. Inevitably, the police would arrive, shut it down, and the whole embarrassing truth would come spilling out. But Parker was rarely around for that part. By then, he'd already disappeared with the cash. Ready to set up his next sale, his operation became so regular that he could almost run it like a shop. Certain days, certain locations, certain types of marks. He developed scripts, refining them over the years, testing which stories drew the fastest trust. If someone balked at the idea of buying the bridge outright, he'd offer a share in the toll rights instead, a lower price point to lure them in. If a customer seemed especially skeptical, he'd plant references, accomplices posing as satisfied owners of other properties Parker had supposedly sold. And while the Brooklyn Bridge was his crown jewel, Parker wasn't afraid to diversify. He sold Madison Square Garden, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and even, on one particularly audacious occasion, the Statue of Liberty. Each sale followed the same pattern. Identify the mark, build trust, produce forged documents, close the deal, vanish by the height of his career. Parker's scams were so legendary in the underworld that other con men studied his methods. He was, in the eyes of his peers, an innovator, someone who had turned the one-off swindle into a sustainable, repeatable art form. What's more, the city's rapid growth worked in his favor. New York was teeming with newcomers from Ellis Island arrivals to domestic migrants, and many of them were determined to make it by any means necessary. In that heady, chaotic environment, a deal for something like the Brooklyn Bridge didn't seem as far-fetched as it would today. After all, in an age when fortunes were made overnight in railroads, steel, and oil, why not bridges? And so Parker's bridge sales empire rolled on, transaction after transaction, each one a careful dance of persuasion, paperwork, and just enough urgency to push the deal through before doubt could creep. And, of course, no empire lasts forever, and Parker's was no exception. But before the inevitable fall, there were still more sales to be made, more marks to fleece, and more stories to add to the legend of the man who sold the Brooklyn Bridge. If you had wandered the streets of New York in the early years of the 20th century, there's a good chance you would have seen George C. Parker at his most confident. He still walked with the air of a man who owned the city, pausing to tip his hat to passers-by, never hurrying, never looking over his shoulder. It was the swagger of a man who believed that the rules of the world bent naturally around him. But even Parker, a master of playing people and situations, could not ignore that something was changing in the city. The police were getting smarter, more organized, and more willing to share notes. What used to be an endless playground for con men was slowly becoming a tighter arena. And George, though clever, had made enemies. His bridge schemes had embarrassed too many well-connected people. The first hints of trouble came in small ways. A man Parker had convinced to buy a section of Coney Island failed to keep quiet about it. Instead, he had loudly told acquaintances about his new investment, a few of whom happened to be acquainted with the real owners. That man's humiliation had quickly traveled through circles Parker preferred to keep ignorant. It was only a matter of time before the stories reached the ears of someone with the power to act. Then there was the arrival of a particular police detective, whose name would eventually become a thorn in Parker's side, Detective Inspector Thomas F. Burns. Burns was not new to chasing criminals. In fact, he had built a reputation for cracking down on the type of slick operators who thought themselves untouchable. Burns's philosophy was simple. A con man should never feel safe. He liked to close in slow, letting the target grow comfortable before striking. George didn't know Burns personally yet, but he started hearing the man's name in taverns and pool halls. Friends would whisper about an inspector who could spot a liar by the way they held their drink. Some said Burns had a photographic memory for faces. Others claimed he kept a rogues gallery, photographs of every known criminal in New York, catalogued with notes. It was a rumor that made Parker raise an eyebrow. A man like that could be trouble. But George, being George, didn't stop. He had never been good at walking away from a good scam. By 1905, Parker was diversifying his plays. The Brooklyn Bridge was still his flagship con, but he'd branched into other landmarks, City Hall, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, even the Statue of Liberty. In his mind, these were variations on a theme. All you needed was paperwork, a good suit, and the absolute certainty that you had the right to sell whatever you claimed to own. And if the buyer hesitated, well, that was when Parker's gift of improvisation came in. Still, the cracks were starting to show. On one occasion, Parker sold the Brooklyn Bridge to a man from the Midwest, took his money, and left him with an official-looking deed. The man promptly went to the bridge to set up toll booths, only to be stopped by police before he could nail the first plank. When questioned, the buyer proudly showed them the paperwork Parker had given him. The officers recognized Parker's handiwork immediately. Word of the incident found its way to Burns's desk. The real turning point came when Parker, in a moment of carelessness, targeted the wrong kind of mark, a man with ties to both the police and the press. Parker had convinced him to invest in an exclusive ferry line, soon to be the only legal route across the East River, claiming he had inside information that the Brooklyn Bridge was going to be closed to public use. It was an absurd story, but Parker's delivery was flawless. The man handed over the money, then bragged about his inside scoop to a journalist friend, who promptly investigated and exposed the scam in print. The article was sensational. It called Parker the man who would sell the city piece by piece if you let him, and though it didn't use his real name, it described his appearance in enough detail for the police to take notice. Detective Burns now had confirmation that the man in his files, the one with the too charming smile and the expensive watch, was back in business. Over the following months, Parker began to notice more eyes on him. A conversation at a bar would be interrupted by a man pretending to read the paper, but clearly listening in. A poker game would end abruptly when someone recognized his face. Friends became cautious, keeping their distance, afraid of being caught up in whatever storm was brewing. Yet Parker carried on, as if daring fate to make its move. Eventually, the net began to tighten in earnest. Burns's men shadowed Parker, noting his haunts, his favorite cafes, his hotel of choice. They tracked the way he moved from Mark to Mark, always circling back to the bridge. To Parker, it felt like a game of chess, only now someone else was making bold moves. He didn't know it yet, but his time as New York's most audacious salesman was coming to a close still. Even in the face of mounting pressure, George couldn't resist one last grand play. And, as always, it involved the Brooklyn Bridge. By the winter of 1928, George C. Parker had been playing the long game for nearly 4 decades. He had survived scandals, outsmarted lawmen, and talked his way out of enough sticky situations to fill a book. But by now the New York he once owned, in spirit if not in deed, was changing faster than he could adapt. Skyscrapers were rising. Automobiles were clogging streets that once echoed with the sound of horseshoes. And the police had become better at their craft. Detectives no longer chased pickpockets in the alleys. They studied fraud, tracked paper trails, and even coordinated across city departments. For a man like Parker, who relied on the city's chaos and disconnection, this was a dangerous evolution. Still, The itch never left him. The thrill of the Kong, that moment when a mark's eyes lit up with greedy belief, was as intoxicating as ever. And so, despite the growing risk, Parker decided to stage one final glorious sail of the Brooklyn Bridge. This was to be the bridge sail, the one that would remind everyone, especially himself, that he was still the master. The mark was perfect. A wealthy out-of-town businessman, let's call him Henry Whitcomb, who had made his fortune in manufacturing, but knew next to nothing about city politics or public works. Henry had come to New York seeking investment opportunities, and Parker's introduction was arranged through a chain of acquaintances, so that it seemed natural, even accidental. Parker played his role to perfection. He greeted Henry with the warmth of an old friend, dropped the right names, and spoke of city infrastructure privatization as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Over several days, he wove a narrative about how the city, burdened by debt, was quietly selling off certain properties to trusted private investors, men of vision, who could maintain them while turning a respectable profit. He showed Henry documents, beautiful, embossed, official-looking deeds that Parker had been perfecting for years. He took him on a private inspection tour of the bridge, walking with a confidence that made it seem he truly had authority there. He even staged a conversation with a bribed city clerk who confirmed the deal was legitimate. Henry was hooked. The price, a staggering $50,000, was steep, but Parker framed it as a steal. In a few years, he said with that famous smile, you'll be making back twice that in toll fees. You'll thank me. Henry paid. Parker pocketed the money, and for a few fleeting hours he felt invincible again, but the world had changed. This time Henry wasn't an isolated mark who would quietly slink away in embarrassment when the truth came out. This was a man with political friends and a sense of outrage. By the next morning the police were involved, and this time they knew exactly who to look for. Detective Burns wasn't the man leading the charge anymore. Time had passed him by, but his methods lived on. Parker was recognized almost instantly from the rogues gallery photographs kept at police headquarters. Witnesses placed him at multiple recent scams, and when they finally cornered him at a hotel near Madison Square, there was no room for his usual theatrics. The police had every piece of evidence they needed. Parker was arrested and charged with grand larceny. At his trial, the prosecutors painted him as a charming predator, a man who had made a career out of selling what was never his to sell. The newspapers had a field day. Headlines blared, "Bridge seller finally behind bars." The jury didn't take long. Parker was sentenced to life in prison at Sing Sing, an unusually harsh punishment for fraud, but by then his name was so notorious that the court wanted to make an example of him. Inside prison, Parker's charm didn't fade. Fellow inmates and guards alike were regaled with his tales, though whether they believed half of them is another matter. He became something of a legend behind bars, the man who sold the Brooklyn Bridge not once, but dozens of times, George. See, Parker died in 1936 at the age of 67, still serving his sentence. And yet, in a strange way, he got exactly what every con man dreams of: immortality. His name became shorthand for a scam so outrageous you'd have to be a fool to believe it. Even today, if someone says, "I've got a bridge to sell you," they're channeling the ghost of Parker. He may have been a criminal, but he was also a craftsman of illusion, a man who turned thin air into opportunity and dreams into deeds. And for nearly 40 years he managed to sell New York City's most famous landmark to anyone willing to believe that, just maybe, they could own a piece of it.